Welcome back to The Urban Organism, the channel for people who love cities. In today's episode, I'm going to answer the question, does Australia have urban primacy? If you're not familiar with the concept of primacy, it describes a territory, either a country, a state, a province, that is dominated by its largest city. So the largest city is much larger than the next largest city. There really aren't any comparably sized cities. The economy is centralized and dominated by this single city. And it's an interesting concept of Australia because Australia is, in some respects, two things in one, and I'll explain. Um, so let me share my screen. Before I get into answering the question, just a quick plug for an excellent website for city population stats. In order to talk about urban primacy, you'll need city populations. And this is an excellent website called citypopulation.de. It comes to us from Germany. And this researcher does an excellent job of pulling together various census data from around the world. And his data are usually and frequently cited in the scientific literature. So it's considered a legitimate source for good population measures and various different kinds of population measures because cities can be measured, or their population can be measured in different ways. So just a little plug there, and we'll get into what I want to talk about. Okay. And one more plug before we get into this is I'm coming to you as a researcher from the Australian Urban Design Research Centre. I'm a researcher at the University of Western Australia. That's sort of my background. And here we go. So does Australia have urban primacy? This is something I've looked at quite a lot. And here's a map of Australia. This is a sort of a satellite composite at night of city lights at night in Australia. And these lines represent the state boundaries. So Australia has 6 states and a very large territory here, the Northern Territory, and then there's a small territory right here, the Australian Capital Territory. But what we're really going to look at are these 6 states. So we've got Victoria here, New South Wales, Queensland, South Australia, Tasmania, and Western Australia. And the reason this question is interesting and sort of complex is just visually you can see how each state appears to exhibit urban primacy. So our population is concentrated in one center in each state. There's this huge third of a continent-sized state, Western Australia, also known as WA. And there's Perth, the capital of the state. And that is really the only major city in that state. Here's Melbourne here in Victoria, and it's really the only major city in the state. So does Australia have urban primacy? So these are some data to put primacy in perspective, both in Australia and internationally. And so nationally, if you were to look at Australia and compare its different cities together, and I pulled together city population stats from that website I shared before, you'd find that Australia has actually got a very low measure of primacy. So a high measure is really anything over 1.5. And the way to very simply measure primacy, there's a couple ways to do it, but this is a way that requires the least amount of data. You take the largest city's population and you divide that by the second and third cities' populations combined. And if you get a number over 1.5, you're starting to get into high primacy. If you get a number over 2, you've got very high primacy. So Australia has low primacy, and when you think that through, you've got Melbourne, which is, interestingly enough, now Australia's largest city by about 100,000 people, so it's getting quite a margin above Sydney now. But you've got Melbourne, you've got Sydney, you've got Brisbane, and these cities are generally, yeah, there is a hierarchy of size, but there's no one city that really dominates the urban hierarchy nationally. Melbourne is about 5.1 million, Sydney's about 5 million, and then Brisbane is about 2.6 million. So sort of even there, actually. But once you get into the states and you start to measure primacy in each state, you will find some of the highest measures of urban primacy on Earth, both in the scale, because these are giant states, and the magnitude. The numbers are very high, particularly in South Australia, Western Australia, Victoria, and New South Wales, where these are really high numbers. It suggests that there really are no second cities whatsoever. The primate city is standing above. Now, to put it into perspective, I've also included measures of primacy for Canada's 3 most populous provinces, measures of primacy for the United States' most populous states, and then measures of primacy for different countries around the world. And what you see is Canadian provinces also have a fairly high measure of primacy. So in British Columbia, Vancouver is 4.59 times larger than the next two cities combined. That's very high. And then in Quebec, Montreal is four times larger than the next two cities combined, also very high. And then lastly, in Ontario, Toronto is 3.87 times bigger than the next two cities combined. So these are also very high measures of primacy. Canadian provinces exhibit a high degree of primacy. It's when you get to American states where you'll find relatively lower measures. So California is getting high 1.57, and that's because when I measured it, I used a very inclusive measure of what is considered LA. That's including Riverside and the San Fernando Valley. So all of the sprawl. In my opinion, when you measure primacy, you really should try to get the entire built environment when you're looking at a city. The city is the built environment. But then Texas and Florida are very decentralized urban systems. There's multiple large cities. No one city is really dominant. There's a lot of competition. And then these are national examples of high primacy, pretty well examined cases of high primacy. Thailand is probably got the highest measure as a country in the world. Philippines has a high measure. Argentina is a classic case of urban primacy. France is a good example of primacy in Europe, where Paris is three times larger than any other than the next two largest cities combined. Nigeria also, Lagos is 2.3 times larger than the next two cities combined. And then Mexico, which is probably one of the most well-examined cases of urban primacy in the world for being very high. Mexico City is 2.15 times larger than the next two cities combined. So in answer to the question, does Australia have urban primacy? It's a yes and a no. At a national level, no, Australia does not have primacy. There's no one city that dominates. But in its states, Australian states exhibit very high measures of primacy. And some Australians will say, well, Queensland is decentralized, right? Because there's multiple large regions. Or Tasmania is decentralized, right? Because there's a few cities in addition to Hobart, like Devonport or Launceston. While these are the more decentralized examples, or they have the lowest measures of primacy in the country, so for Australia, these are more decentralized. Queensland has a measure of primacy on par with Mexico, which, like I said before, is one of the most well-examined cases. So really, primacy is in every state in Australia. I won't delve into why that is the case. That was the subject of my PhD research, and I will do some episodes on that. But first, just to set the scene. Australia does have urban primacy in its states. They are some of the most extreme examples you can find on the planet in terms of the size of the territory where primacy is observable, and the magnitude at which the largest city is dominant, meaning the gap between the largest city and the second city is one of the widest that you will find on Earth. So that sort of is it for this episode. Thank you for your time and attention, and I'll see you next time on The Urban Organism.